Of all people, it was Charlie Chaplin, the great entertainer, who said, "This is a ruthless world, and one must be ruthless to cope with it." And throughout the course of history, many have followed his advice. From cold-blooded killers to sportsmen who show no mercy. It was carnage. Some people will stop at nothing to get what they want. But getting away with it, well now, that's a very different story. Christchurch, New Zealand, 1954. This is our Mar Street. That is the local courtroom. And look at that picture. How old do you reckon these two girls are? 20, 25? No, they're 15 and 16, and they're standing just about here, about to be tried for the murder of her mum. It was a crime like no other. Two girls so infatuated with each other that they'd kill to stay together. The relationship between the two girls was really intense, wasn't it?
Yes. One way you might describe it it was a cult of two, and the two of them were totally wrapped up in each other. They had an extremely rich fantasy life, there's no question about that. They wrote novels, and they were planning to go to Hollywood to have these turned into pictures.
And they thought that Pauline's mum was the one block preventing them from going to Hollywood and being glittering successes.
They thought, actually, Juliet was going to be taken away from New Zealand. She was going to be living with an aunt for a while in South Africa. And Pauline was led to believe by the Humes that as long as her mother gave permission, she would be able to go with Juliet. And there was absolutely no possibility that Pauline's mother was going to agree. She couldn't wait for the Humes to leave New Zealand and hopefully reclaim her daughter.
So the two girls lured Pauline's mother to the outskirts of Christchurch. They dropped a pretty pebble in the path. She leant over. Pauline had got a sock with a big rock in it, started whacking her on the head. Juliet comes back. The two of them are whacking her and whacking her 20 or 30 times, and eventually she dies.
Yes, that's correct, yes. It was an extraordinarily savage attack. They thought they might be able to just give her one whack on the head and she would obligingly die, but it wasn't like that at all. It was an extremely nasty, bloody, messy business.
The very next day, both girls were arrested and committed to trial. You can understand, can't you, why local people would have been so excited about it. I mean, they came flocking in every day. The courtroom was jam-packed, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
There's the two girls who some people were saying were having a lesbian relationship. There was all this elitism. One of the girls was English, one of the girls was New Zealand, one was richer, one was poorer.
It's absolutely scandalised. I mean, it's the biggest scandal that's ever hit Christchurch. The noses of news editors all over the world told them that as soon as they started to hear about it.
While the court case captured the headlines, Juliet and Pauline seemed strangely unconcerned.
I don't think they cared too much, really, whether the plot succeeded or not, because I think they thought that, well, even if they're caught and they're arrested, they will remain together. And the one thing they didn't think of is that they would be separated in the prison system.
On the 29th of August 1954, Juliet and Pauline were found guilty of murder. They never saw each other again. The two girls did go on to live relatively successful and long lives, didn't they?
Yes, they did, and they're both alive. They're both alive today. Juliet Hume became Anne Perry, and she's a very successful writer of murder mysteries, funnily enough. Pauline, before she retired, was the headmistress of a special needs school in Kent in England.
Together, Pauline and Juliet were pathological, but separated, they managed to live productive and benign lives. But the same can't be said for the cold-blooded killer on my next time travel. 400 years ago, he single-handedly created mayhem and murder on an unimaginable scale. I'm on the west coast of Australia, on the trail of a real-life horror story that began with a dreadful shipwreck in 1629. A state-of-the-art ship called the Batavia left Holland, crowded with people, in order to buy spices in the East Indies. But a wind blew up, she was blown off course, and she foundered on a reef about 450 kilometres from here. And they've got a piece of the ship right here in this room. Isn't that fantastic? On board the Batavia was a merchant named Hieronymus Cornelius, who subscribed to a very unusual philosophy, that it was God's will that man enjoy without hindrance everything that gives pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, we want to retell the story of what happened to the passengers and crew of the Batavia after it had become grounded. And it was this relentless pursuit of desire that led to events so ridiculously macabre that they could have come straight from a pantomime. Well, this is day one, all right? Yeah, and you're all staggering around. There's about 300 people, dazed and confused. The very first thing that happened was that the captain, who was a very brave man, I'll choose you because you're the tallest, how do you do? He decided that with a few of his men, he would row in an open boat to present-day Jakarta, which was over 30 days away. Really tremendously scary thing to do. So off you go, off to Jakarta, which meant that they were left without a leader. This was the moment Cornelius had been waiting for. If he could eliminate the competition, not only would he survive, but he could seize any relief ship that might appear and take off with it. And he ordered the troops who were on board to go off and forage for food, firewood, that sort of thing. Who's going to be the troops? Troops, all right, can you go to this island, see what you can find, just over there. And as soon as they were there, he nicked the boat, so they are now marooned, and presumably they're going to die. And then he chose some of the younger passengers. Will you two be the younger passengers? They became his police, his enforcers, and he dressed them up in gold and red uniforms, and they started picking on the rest of the passengers. We don't like the look of you. Can you kill that passenger? That's it. And very soon, he didn't need any kind of excuse, just anybody he wanted to, he would order to be killed. 125 men, women and children were slaughtered in the carnage that followed. A few of them escaped. Who's going to escape? Right, OK, and they went off to the island and they warned the troops about what was happening, and the troops threw up a stockade made out of driftwood. This is actually one of the cannons off the Batavia, so you can use that if you like. And Hieronymus's men attacked the fort, and they were thrown back, and then they attacked it again and were thrown back again, and they were just about to overwhelm the troops when what happened? Who should come back but our hero, the captain? Come on back. And this is the rescue boat, right, all the way from Jakarta, and the troops tried to tell him what was happening, and Hieronymus's men tried to tell him what was happening, and he realised that Hieronymus's men were absolutely evil. And put out your hands. They hacked off their hands with a chisel and a mallet, and then they executed them. While Cornelius's execution may have restored some semblance of justice, it was no compensation for the massive loss of life he caused. In the case of Geronimus Cornelius, his murderous intentions were blatantly obvious. But on my next time travel to the late 18th century, the motives behind another series of calculated attacks were a real mystery. In 1790, the shores of Sydney Harbour were bristling with tension. 2 years after the establishment of the British penal colony in New South Wales, the governor, Captain Arthur Phillip, faced a dilemma. He'd arrived with explicit orders from King George of England to build relations with the natives of Australia, who had been described to him as timid and nomadic. But the Aborigines were avoiding the settlement and attacking anyone who strayed from it. The governor had to find ways to turn things around. But in order to do this, he did something which to an 18th century British imperialist might have seemed very sensible, but to us seems at best bizarrely unacceptable and at worst a criminal offence. He identified a likely-looking Aboriginal and kidnapped him. His first victim was Arabanu, a gentle and curious man who tragically died of smallpox while in the governor's care. But Philip was nothing if not persistent. He kidnapped 2 more Aboriginal men, Bennelong and Colby, and you could say it was a success of sorts. As odd as it seems, Bennelong and the governor did develop a friendship. Bennelong learned English and called Philip father. But behind the harmonious facade, the list of grievances committed against the original inhabitants was growing daily. Tension between the 2 groups started pretty quickly, didn't it, when it became obvious they were competing for food?
When the early colony first started to understand how Aboriginal people would use this food, they started to watch and copy and then start to eat all of the food. And then Aboriginal people, especially the Gadigal people and other neighbouring clans, they were thinking, well, we've always made sure that there was enough for tomorrow and you're just catching everything and eating it all. So there would have been a lot of tension being built up and a lot of anger inside. And, you know, why are you here? What are you doing this for? Do you not understand what you're doing? Wanting for this great way of life to be respected and to be understood and appreciated, which in fact it wasn't at that time.
One day, without any warning, Bennelong disappeared, and Philip was said to be devastated. So when Bennelong sent a message to Philip asking him to meet at a beach across the harbour, he set off without hesitation. What occurred next, right here in Manly Cove, is one of the defining events in early colonial history. OK, so there was Philip on the beach.
Yeah.
What happened next?
Well, he saw his friend Bennelong.
Yeah.
Tried to greet him. Bennelong was evasive, and Philip noticed a man he'd never met before, an Aboriginal from up in the Broken Bay area, standing up here, further on the beach.
What was the other guy's name?
Willimarang.
Willimarang, yeah, so he's over here. And what's his demeanour?
His demeanour is not evasive, it's grim. And so Philip, being a curious Enlightenment man, comes up and tries to reassure him.
Yeah.
He thinks the man is suffering from the first contact trauma.
Yeah.
And the man is aggressive, steps back, and drives the spear through his shoulder.
I don't think you'd have been laughing quite this much. What happened to him?
Philip immediately staggers. Of course, the men think that there is a massacre on. They're very worried. They got him back to the boat.
Yeah.
With this in him.
Still in him?
Yeah.
Oh, right, yeah.
It had gone through. They had to row him way up the harbour
Yeah.
to Sydney, 7 miles. And up there, he said, no retaliation. I don't want anything done. The shaft was taken out by a less than brilliant surgeon named Balmain, and Philip, through that ordeal, still kept saying no retaliation.
Philip could be forgiven for thinking he'd survived an attempted assassination, but somehow he understood that he was being sent a message. Why do you think that Willemering attacked Philip?
I think he was, my theory, a ritual punisher of the kind that exists in Aboriginal society as a keeper of order, like a judge in our courts. And I think although Philip mightn't have realised that it was a payback, he did have a sense that they had something coming to them.
With justice delivered, Bennelong was now ready to negotiate a new deal for his people.
I don't want to say that we've ever given up, but I believe that we knew that it was about, okay, they're here staying now. We need to keep our culture, we need to keep our language, we need to keep our connection to this land. So how can we both live here and keep that connection after we realised that the resistance wasn't having the impact we would have hoped?
A meeting was arranged between Philip and Bennelong on the harbour. After years of mistrust, an understanding between the two sides was reached and Aboriginal people entered the new settlement. The combination of Philip's and Bennelong's cold-blooded plotting led to a brief moment of reconciliation. But sadly, it wouldn't last long. Over the next century, the colonisers moved across the continent, devastating indigenous communities in their wake. Not that the inland explorers had it easy either. I'm now travelling forward in time to the 1840s to join a murderous expedition in which the villain was one of their own. A lot of the brave explorers who crisscrossed this vast land are now justifiably famous here in Australia. But there's one man who opened up huge tracts of South Australia, including what's now its most successful wine-growing area. But that's not what made him famous at all. He's celebrated for something entirely different. John Horrocks arrived in Australia on his 21st birthday, carrying a burning desire to make his mark on the colony. The young gent made a good fist of farming, but soon decided exploring was more to his nature. For that purpose, he imported Harry, the very first camel to arrive in Australia. I know a lot of camels are really sweet-tempered, but Harry was a bit of a monster. The first thing he did was bite the head of the chief tent man called Garlic, and there were 2 huge gashes in Garlic's forehead and one down his cheek. Then Harry bit one of the goats, shook him by the scruff of its neck and apparently tried to eat it, and then finally he took a bite out of the flour bag. And of course that caused a great big trail of white all the way behind them and used up a lot of valuable supplies. Now, all that might sound like a bit of comedy, but then things got much darker. Horrocks, up ahead, saw a sweet little bird and thought, oh, this is going to look great for my stuffed bird collection. So he went to get his gun, and at that moment, Harry lurched or something, and the gun went off, and it went right through Horrocks' hand, knocking off all his right fingers, then through his cheek, and knocked all his teeth out. When he was shot, young Horrocks was just 3 days into his grand adventure. A week after that, he dictated what would be his final recorded words. They read, "It is with the greatest regret I have to inform the committee and my fellow colonists who subscribed towards the expenses of the expedition of its untimely and unfortunate termination." A very polite, dare I say typically British way of saying, "I've been shot, so the trip's off." What motivated Harry to be so aggressive is a matter of pure conjecture. But what we do know is that he kept up the fight to the very end. Horrocks contracted gangrene and died 23 days later. But before he passed away, he ordered that the camel should be shot. It took 2 bullets to kill Harry, and only after he'd managed to take one final bite out of a stockman's head. On my time travels through murder and mayhem, I've seen how malevolence takes on many guises. But cold-blooded instincts aren't just limited to killers. I'm now jumping forward a century to the 1930s, when an extraordinary ruthless act shocked a nation. In 1933, one of the most brutal sporting tactics ever invented was employed here at the Adelaide Oval in South Australia.
It's January the 14th, 1933, day 2 of the 3rd cricket test in the most controversial Ashes series ever played. The Australians are about to start their first innings, chasing England's 341.
3 years earlier, the star Australian batsman Donald Bradman had demolished England's bowling attack in the 1930s Ashes series. Now on tour in Australia, English captain Douglas Jardine was not about to let this happen again. He decided to ruthlessly employ the bodyline tactic. Basically, what this meant was that his bowlers would steam in, they'd bowl the ball really short and hard so that it would bounce up and smack the batsman on his body unless he defended himself, and there would be a ring of fieldsmen all the way around him so that if the ball hit his bat, it would glance off and they would be able to catch him out. It was highly aggressive and it was carnage. With their players taking blow after blow, the Australian spectators were outraged, continually booing the English attack. But still Jardine pressed on. The Australian captain and opening batsman Bill Woodfill came in and smack, the ball hit him on the heart. Then the wicket-keeper Bert Oldfield took the crease. The ball glanced off his bat, hit his head and smashed his skull. When an English player tried to apologise for the incident, Woodfill famously remarked, "There are 2 teams out there, only one of them was playing cricket." Tensions became so high that the tour was almost cancelled after the Australian cricket administrators accused the English of unsportsmanlike behaviour. It took the intervention of the Australian Prime Minister Joseph Lyons to broker a truce. England went on to win the series, but it came at a price. While Bradman was lauded a cricketing hero, Jardine became forever associated with a tactic that tarnished cricket's reputation. From cricketers to camels, there's no end to those who are prepared to act in cold blood. But if there's one thing I've learnt on this time travel, it's that the relentless pursuit of ambition imprisons in many ways. From the loss of life and liberty to the loss of honour and friendship. Getting away with murder is much harder than it seems.